Greetings. This video is about using the RNAV-X Runway 33 approach at Paro International, Victor, Quebec, Romeo, Papa in Bhutan. Now, this is not a tutorial. I'm still in the learning phase. So if you have any comments, if somebody has any experience flying this approach, they can leave it in the comments down below. Now, the aircraft that we will be flying is the TOLIS A319, Airbus A319, and we'll be using the Bhutan Air livery, and we'll be using a fictitious flight number, Bhutan Air 171. Now, as I said, this is not a tutorial, so you'll be seeing a lot of things that I do that I should not have done, and hopefully I'll make another one, proper tutorial, as I get more experienced. We are flying out of Kathmandu International, Victor November Kilo Tango, and our cruise altitude is 31,000 feet, which is flight level 310. So let's have a look at the approach chart and the restrictions that we need to follow. Now, this is the best free chart that I could get from Googling. We will be flying the Subsu 1 star or standard terminal arrival. Our transition for this approach is PR 888 or Papa Romeo 888, and the initial approach fix is also called Papa Romeo 888. Restrictions are that the aircraft has to be above 17,000 feet and at a maximum speed of 185 knots. The next set of restrictions come at PR 740 and PR 738. At PR 740, the aircraft should be above 14,400 feet, and at PR 738, the aircraft should be above 13,600 feet. At PR 736 and at PR 734, the aircraft should be above 13,100 feet and 12,400 feet respectively. As for the final approach fix, which is at PR 712, the aircraft should be at 11,800 feet and at a maximum speed of 145 knots. The MDA, or the minimum descent altitude, is 10,630 feet, and the go-around altitude is 16,000 feet. Now, as you descend, things will start happening very rapidly, and it's very difficult to keep track of the altitude and the speed restrictions, and that's what makes this approach very difficult or challenging. And also, if you're running live weather, then at most times or a number of times, you'll get a very heavy tailwind. To counter that, you could either descend earlier or you could manage your speed better. You could use manual speed, lower your landing gear as soon as possible, And I think, in my opinion, that's the only way you can control your speed because you'll be descending at a very high rate. Now, I did not talk about the RNP, or the required navigational performance constraints that the aircraft has to follow in this RNAV approach, because in an RNAV approach, there are no ground localizers that are used. It's all GPS based, and I'm not that well informed on RNP constraints, but the aircraft does a very good job of following them. So on this flight, on this segment, once you reach the top of climb, you have a very short time before you can enter the descent data into the MCDU or the FMC and start descending. So here we are, we've almost reached our cruise altitude, and in a moment you'll see that the FMGC will display the enter destination data in amber text. Also, I'm using manually configured weather. So the QNH, once you set it in X-Plane 11, it is the same for all airports, arrival or destination, wherever you go, it's the same. And temperature may vary on the altitude or the elevation of the uh, airport, but if they're almost at the same elevation, it should remain the same. Time to enter our destination data, and the QNH is 1015. Temperature was 4 at Kathmandu International, and winds are 060, 6 knots at 060 degrees. I initially entered the wrong wind data, but later on I corrected it. So I was looking for the MDA on the chart. At that time, I thought because this chart is a bit old, it might be inaccurate. And then I went on to my little nav map, a free application for flight planning, and wrongly entered the wrong MDA, as you'll see in a moment. Transition altitude is 18,000 feet, and the approach reference speed is 137 knots. You can also get that on your PFD by going into the performance page and clicking on activate approach phase. But I used the manual speed, the speed knob, to reduce it to the approach speed. So during the final approach, you can click on the activate approach phase to get the speed bug on your PFD. I set the initial descent altitude at 17,100 feet. That's just above the altitude restriction at the initial approach fix PR 888. Still another 40 nautical miles to go till the top of descent. Based on previous experience flying this route, I decreased the speed manually to 200 knots. And as you'll see, it's very difficult to maintain the speed without any drag or flaps. Initiating descent, I bumped up the speed to 210 knots, uh, probably because I thought it might not descend as early or before it reaches 200 knots. So I just wanted to descend because I was already on top of at the top of descent. Now I've flown RNAV approaches at Santos Dumont, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and this one also. Usually, what I've noticed is that the RNAV guidance will bring the aircraft a bit above uh, the required altitude, and that's why I probably started the vertical speed and I turned the vertical speed knob in order to descend rapidly because I did not want to end high and fast by the time I reached the final approach fix. On the navigational display, the magenta colored D in the magenta colored circle, that's the deceleration point. And that gives you a very small window of opportunity to slow down your aircraft, go to flaps 2, and in this approach, you should probably, it's advised that you should lower your landing gear too because you'll be descending at a very rapid pace, and controlling your speed would be easier if you lower your landing gear as soon as possible. I was a bit late in extending the speed brakes and going to flaps 2, but I managed to slow down the aircraft just in time. Around this point, the aircraft will capture the glide path, which is for the RNAV navigation. You'll see the VDEV and the LDEV symbologies on the PFD. It's a glide path, unlike the glide slope when you're on an ILS approach or a precision approach. In order to fly an RNAV RNP approach, you have to press the approach button. Now, I'm not exactly sure at what point of the approach phase you should push that button. Uh, I've heard a few YouTubers say it should be at the final approach fix, but in the sim, you can press it earlier. If anyone has any comments about this, they can share them with me. So as you can see, we are below the glide path indicated by the VDEV green brick or the bracket. And I guess it wasn't a good idea to use the vertical speed initially to descend very low. And right now it's burning, the engines are at a very high thrust and it's burning a lot of fuel. So I think it's better to let the plane or the FMGC do its thing rather than tamper with it. So we're almost at the initial approach fix, PR 888, and we're quite high, 19,900 feet, and that's above the restriction. That's within the restriction actually, and I've set the next descent altitude to 11,800 feet. That's the altitude for the final approach fix. I've also reduced the speed to 160 knots, and let's see. I've skipped ahead in time, and we are now going to fly over PR 736, and we're following the altitude restrictions. And let's see what happens next. Almost at the initial approach fix, and as you'll see, the aircraft will dive and reach the proper altitude. We're already at 145 knots, and I think it does a good job of following the RNAV guidance, the glide path. Once the aircraft goes into the final app mode, you can set your go around altitude, which is 16,000 feet in our case. At this point, I did a situation save just in case if the landing did not go well, and it did not. And as you'll see, the landing that you saw in the intro was actually a replay of my third attempt. So after this, I disconnected the autopilot and went on to final approach and did a landing. It wasn't that good. So I tried again and I succeeded partially, in my opinion, in the third attempt. It's the best possible landing that I could do at this airport so far. So after this clip, you'll see the replay. So this is the replay of my third attempt. So I turned off the terrain and system buttons on the GPWS system, on the GPSWS panel. And because I saw this in a real world landing of a Bhutan Air A319, I'll link the video in the description below.
2,500. 2,000. 100 above. Minimum.
In an RNAV approach, after disconnecting the autopilot, the flight directors should also be turned off.
2,000.
As you'll see, I descended quite steeply at this point, and later on, my final approach or my landing was too shallow. I should not have done that. I should have kept a normal descent rate.
One thousand. 500. 400. 300.
Caution, taxiway. Caution,
200.
taxiway.
200.
Taxiway.
100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. 10. 5.
1,500 meters remaining.
Not exactly on the center line, but I'll take it. Welcome to the Kingdom of Bhutan, and that was it. I'll end the video with a few more replays from different perspectives.